Does daycare really have an impact on children's social and behavioral development? As someone who worked in a daycare and saw some negative effects on the children that I was interacting with, I really wanted to dig deeper and study whether daycare actually had an effect on these children, or whether that is just perhaps perceived, or whether that was just my experience with my specific daycare that I worked at. After listening to people like Dr. Erica Komazar and Suzanne Vanker, I decided to look into this a little bit deeper, and I looked at a study done by Michael Baker, Jonathan Gruber, and Kevin Milligan to see if what was being said about daycare, how it helps the child's socialization, how it's beneficial for your child to go and be amongst other children when they're very, very young. What the article seemed to indicate was the exact opposite. In the article that I've read, along with several others done by those same three people, they did this study in Quebec looking into how the behavioral impact of a Quebec daycare system impacted the child's social development. In most of these cases, children, especially who already struggled with hyperactivity, anxiety, aggression, and indirect aggression, became worse. That the daycare system actually tended to increase behavioral problems, especially for those who already had high scores of behavioral problems, indicating that there was some other item going on that was already impacting these children, and then daycare tend to increase that with their behavioral problems. Now, this study took place over a period of time, and so they followed back up to see if this would have any long-term effects. And it says that for youth and young adults ages 12 to 20, analyses of self-reported general health and life satisfaction indicated that negative social and emotional outcomes associated with exposure to the daycare program existed into young adulthood. The most striking finding was a sharp and contemporaneous increase in criminal behavior for those exposed to the universal daycare program compared to their peers in other provinces. So specifically for the Quebec daycare program, that is how this played out, even though crime rates are lower in Quebec than other parts of Canada. Now, the study also acknowledged that there are some evidence of positive impacts from the universal childcare programs in certain nations for children of certain ages. However, in most of the cases, the benefits are primarily for the less advantaged children. So children who already don't have a stable parental care or some sort of stable household, they're less advantaged in some way. Maybe they're poverty stricken, maybe they're in a single parent household. The universal system actually did provide positive impacts for helping them, which would make sense because they're already in that less advantaged situation. I just want to insert a little pause here to remind you to go ahead and click that subscribe button if you haven't. I talk about living an intentional life, and so part of that is dealing with your mindset towards daycare, your mindset towards a lot of different types of things, but overall, living an intentional life rooted in God's word. I talk about motherhood, pregnancy, wifehood, and items like this that are social issues that we can be developing a better mindset and creating more knowledge for ourselves so we can continue to make better decisions. If you enjoy content like this, go ahead and click that subscribe button. It really helps. Thank you. However, in the more broad standpoint, for the majority of children who are raised in loving, great, advantaged households where the parents are a loving influence in their life, there is little clear evidence that the programs of the universal daycare provide significant benefits for those children. The children in the study by age 4.5, extensive hours, so especially much greater hours in daycare, predicted negative social outcomes in every area, including social competence, externalizing problems, and adult-child conflict, generally at a rate 3 times higher than other children. In caregiver reports of behavioral problems, only 2% of children who averaged less than 10 hours a week of daycare during the first 4 years of life had at-risk scores. So about 2% of those kids who were going less than 10 hours a week, while as much as 18% who averaged more than 30 hours a week did. Family economic status, maternal education, quality of childcare, and caregiver closeness did not moderate these effects, but would those effects persist? Throughout the rest of this article, and like I said, a lot of the information that Dr. Erica Komisar talks about is how in many cases, daycare actually isn't an ideal for sending your kids to if you're trying to help encourage them to have greater socialization or behavioral outcomes. Emotional stability, things like that are greatly impacted by the daycare system, according to this study. And like I said, the studies that Dr. Erica Komisar looks at the end of the day, we can acknowledge that there are disadvantages of children going to daycare and having every single child be encouraged to be pushed into daycare right away as an ideal option. Now, that's not to say that there won't be people who aren't able to choose an ideal option. And so in those cases where people aren't able to choose the ideal option for their children, daycare is a necessity. And that is completely understandable, especially for single women, single moms, people who have a less advantaged family situation. Like I said, there could be a positive benefit to sending your child to daycare. If you literally cannot provide for them, obviously you need to put food and housing over their heads as a first priority. While this can be true that there are some people who need to send their children to daycare and who need to participate in those programs, it can also be true that we can acknowledge that that is not an ideal situation that we should necessarily put forth and strive for as a grand ideal or as something that everyone across the board should be doing. I talk about my experience with daycare and how that has impacted me and my outlook for how I want to parent the little baby that we have on the way. And so if this conversation was interesting to you, I would encourage you to listen to this episode that I made about my experience with daycare and some negative impacts I think that it had on the children that I worked with. And this is not to say that my situation is every situation, and this is not to say that there aren't some variations and some reasons why daycare is a necessity for some people. I hope that as a society we can come together to agree and realize that as an ideal, as the first point, as a first option, daycare probably isn't the best for your very young children. Like this study said, less than 4.5 years old, and that it can have impacts into their life as adults. I hope that this helps to increase knowledge so that way we can try to take better choices going forward as a society into the future. Knowledge can empower us to make better decisions than we might have otherwise made. If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and give it a thumbs up because that will help me continue to reach more people with this message, with these studies and information like this. And so super beneficial. I thank you guys so much for listening.